Ojos De Gato. This is a story my husband's grandmother told to us about when she was a little girl in Mexico. In a small village located in Jalisco lived a man named Augustine and his beautiful wife, Lupita. Every night, Lupita asked Augustine to walk her to her mother's house so she could have dinner with her mother and two sisters. Augustine would then ask his wife if he may join them, and every time received the same answer, no, followed by some excuse why he wasn't invited. Augustine was upset, but believed his wife would never lie to him or hurt him. So he'd walk his wife a short distance through the darkening village to her mother's home. This pattern continued for around a year, until one night Augustine finally got tired of not seeing his wife or being involved with the family, so he devised a plan. That night he walked Lupita to her mother's house, kissing her goodbye and waving to his mother-in-law and both sisters-in-law. Once Lupita shut the door, Augustine turned back and hid in the bushes beside the house. He managed to find a small opening used for ventilating these kinds of brick adobe houses. At first, Augustine could see nor hear anything. He began to think he was acting foolish, and perhaps he should head home. Just as quickly as that thought entered his head, a candle illuminated the opening. Augustine crouched down lower and peered in, being sure not to make a sound. One by one, candles were lit, and before long the entire room was visible. Augustine's mouth dropped. His eyes did not blink. A chill went up his spine. He could not believe his eyes. Glass jars filled the walls of this cramped room. Glass jars with items and substances. Some had small animals, others gooey material, various sizes and different liquid colors. Augustine's eyes darted all around the room until he focused on Lupita entering through the doorway, wearing a dark-colored cloak. Augustine noticed she was carrying something, but could not make it out. He watched as Lupita joined her mother and two sisters around a small table in the middle of the room. Lupita put a large jar in the center of the table, and the women all stood in a circle. They began to chant quietly, but in perfect harmony, as they walked circles hand in hand around the table. Augustine could do nothing but stare in disbelief. The women suddenly became silent and dropped to the ground in the bowing position. It was then Augustine saw what was in the jar. Cat eyes, different colors, but he was sure they were pairs of cat eyes floating in this jar. To Augustine's horror, the women stood up and proceeded to pull their eyes out from the sockets. They did this with such precision and without a hint of any pain or blood. Augustine fought the feeling of throwing up or passing out. He thought he was losing his mind or in some sort of nightmare. The women then put their eyes into the jar as they grabbed a pair of cat eyes, and in a screw-turning motion pushed the cat eyes into the black gaping sockets. The four women, dressed all in black cloaks, lurked out into the darkness of the night. Scared out of his wits, Augustine ran home praying, and continued this into his bed, where he wanted to believe he was dreaming. The next morning Augustine left his house, headed to church. He spoke with his priest and told the story of his unbelievable night. He did not know what to do now. The priest listened and seemed to understand. He told Augustine he must have undeniable proof of what he was dealing with. Convinced the shepherd would not lead a member of his flock astray, he set out for proof. He waited until his wife left for her mother's house, pretending to feel ill the entire day to avoid her. Augustine could hear his heart beating in his ears as he found himself standing in front of his mother-in-law's door after the women had creeped out into the night. Augustine knew right away which room to enter. It was the only one they never allowed him access to on the rare occasions he was invited to the home. He felt as if the eyes were watching him move toward them from their murky jar. Augustine looked down at the eyeballs, finding his wife's eyes in an instant, and remembering it was her eyes that caught his attention first. Her eyes had a hint of every color, and almost a mesmerizing effect. Augustine knew it was too late for these feelings to stop him from his mission. He took every pair of eyes out of the jar, except his wife's eyes. With the eyes in a pouch, he ran home faster than the night before, for without a doubt in his mind, he knew evil was upon the village. Hiding the jar at home, that night he heard his wife come in, and also thought he heard crying, possibly sobbing. A tear came down his cheek as he began to walk over to Lupita, wiping it away before asking her if she was crying. Lupita turned around with a big smile on her face and said, "No, my love. Why?" Every hair on Augustine's body stood up as he replied, "Nothing, just thought I heard crying." Lupita's smile grew even bigger, and with an awkward pause, she said, "I'm fine." Augustine excused himself and left the house. Walking up to the church, he heard voices, surprising for this time of night, he thought. Opening the doors, Augustine found himself standing in the center of a crowd of his fellow church members. The priest called to Augustine and asked, "Where's the proof?" Augustine replied, "At my mother-in-law's house." The crowd rushed out the door, Augustine now noticing the torches in their hands as they began to light them ablaze. Augustine followed behind the crowd, listening in on the angry voices shouting about destroying the evil. The crowd's bright light of the torch looked like a giant ball of fire moving through the small town as more and more villagers joined in. Young children watched terrified out windows as the mob went down the desolate path to the evil house. As Augustine and the crowd approached, he could see Lupita standing in front of her mother's door. She was already staring at Augustine with a look of hatred he'd never seen before. His stomach sank as the mob pushed her aside and broke open the door. Lupita's mother and sisters were pulled out of the house, which made the entire mob gasp all at once at the sight of their cat eyes. Lupita begged the crowd not to hurt them, as they bound them with rope and dragged her mother and sisters to the large empty field. When that didn't work, she looked at Augustine and said, "You will regret this." Augustine pulled his wife's cat eyes out of his pocket and shouted, "Lupita is a witch too!" But in the chaos of everything, she was nowhere to be found. Lupita's mother and her two sisters were tied to a pike and set on fire using green logs, which will burn for longer. After everything was over, Augustine went home a depressed man. His whole life as he knew it had changed. Years later, people in the village said he lived a very lonely life and would take fewer and fewer trips into town. But when he did, they noticed a black cat following not too far behind him, and it had the prettiest multicolored eyes, almost human eyes.